Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to a new episode of our Letter to Voxa podcast. Today, we are attempting something. Well, something like intellectual mountaineering. We're going to try and scale the sheer logical cliff face that is the early work of Ludwig Wittgenstein.
Specifically his Tractatus Logico Philosophicus.
The TLP, yeah. And this isn't just a book, is it? It's more like a philosophical boundary marker. It's the one text that pretty much defined the entire initial trajectory of 20th century analytic thought.
It is. I mean, it's really no exaggeration to say it's one of the most astonishing intellectual achievements of modern times. And Wittgenstein himself is this fascinating figure because his two major works,
The TLP and the later philosophical investigations.
right, they basically created two entirely separate and equally profound eras of philosophy. So when we focus on the TLP, we're looking at a genius just operating at maximum intensity.
And driven by this almost messianic desire for absolute logical clarity.
That intensity really comes through in the biographical stuff, you know. Bertrand Russell, who was his mentor at Cambridge, he saw this raw power in him right away.
Yeah, I remember reading that. He said Wittgenstein had, fire and penetration and intellectual purity to a quite extraordinary degree.
That purity really defined him. He was born into this fantastically wealthy, culturally significant family in Vienna, and he walked away from it all, dedicated himself completely to solving this riddle of language and the world.
And Russell also mentioned his temperament, right? That he had the disposition of an artist.
Intuitive and moody, yeah.
Sure.
Russell observed that he would begin his work with hope, and every evening he ends in despair.
Wow. You could just picture that struggle. And a lot of the TLP was written under incredible circumstances. He was serving in the Austrian army during World War I.
On the front lines a lot of the time.
And composing these incredibly intricate logical propositions in notebooks while in the middle of active combat, it's just mind-boggling.
And his life continued to intersect with history in these really dramatic ways. You know, later on, when he was a professor at Cambridge, he took over G.E. Moore's chair in 1939.
Right.
A huge political shift happened. The German Anschluss in 1938 made him a German citizen. And because of the Nuremberg laws that followed, he was designated as Jewish, which meant he had to get British citizenship to secure his job and his safety.
An incredibly high-stakes background for a man whose mind was grappling with the most abstract problems imaginable.
And he was so confident in his solution, he claimed the core thoughts in the TLP were unassailable and definitive. He genuinely believed he had finally solved the problems of philosophy.
That conviction is kind of our roadmap for this, then.
It is. Our mission in this deep dive is to unpack the key arguments of the TLP. We want to try and see the world through this lens of pure logic and understand why, even after declaring the problem solved, he insisted the work showed how little has been done.
Right. It's about looking beyond the logical structure to the profound silence he ultimately points to.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to begin at the very beginning with the TLP's foundational declaration. It completely reframes how we think about reality. He doesn't start with physical stuff, with objects.
No, he starts with possibility. The opening statement really sets the tone for everything that follows. The world is also. That is the case.
And then immediately the essential clarification.
The world is the totality of facts, not of things. And this is the first radical break from, common sense. We're taught to think reality is made of concrete things. Atoms, tables, people. Wittgenstein says no, fundamentally, reality is made of facts.
So why is that distinction, facts versus things, so critical for building his logical universe?
Well, because facts are dynamic. They're contingent. A thing is just an object. It doesn't have a truth value on its own. A fact, or a Tatsache, is the existence or non-existence of what he calls a state of affairs.
And atomic fact.
An atomic fact. Facts are what make propositions true or false. So if I say, the phone is charging, the fact isn't the phone or the charger, it's the connection between them existing. Reality changes based on which facts exist. That's why he says the world divides into facts.
So the world is basically a structured network of possibilities that have been realized, not just a pile of objects.
Precisely. But those facts have to be built out of something stable. If facts are the configuration, you need the things being configured. And this brings us to the bedrock of his world, the objects.
And he insists these objects have to be absolutely simple.
Simplicity is absolutely key, because these objects form the substance of the world. And the reason they have to be simple is a purely logical one.
A structural requirement.
Yes. Imagine if the objects themselves were complex, so they were made of even smaller objects. Then, whether my sentence A is next to B even makes sense would depend on whether A and B actually existed.
Which would be another fact.
Exactly. And then you're stuck in an infinite logical regress.
And if you're in that regress, you can never get a stable, definite picture of the world because the meaning of any sentence would always be conditional on something else being true.
That's the logical necessity right there. The simple objects, the substance, they are the fixed, existent, unalterable part. They're the scaffolding. Their configuration is the changing, unstable element that forms the atomic facts.
So the essence of the world isn't the stuff in it, but its potential for combination.
You got it. And that bridges us to his idea of internal properties and logical space. When we talk about an object, we're not talking about a blank slate. The nature of an object already contains all the possibilities of its occurrence in states of affairs. It's defined by what it can connect with.
Okay, let's elaborate on that. What does it mean to know an object's internal properties?
It means if you truly know an object, you know every potential combination it can enter into. You know its logical place. For instance, think of a point in a geometric space. An internal property of that point is that it must have coordinates. It doesn't have to be these specific coordinates, but it has to exist in that system of space. That potential is inherent.
I found the analogy of the speck in a visual field really helpful here.
Oh yeah, that's a great one. Imagine a tiny speck in your vision. You don't know its color, but you know it must have a color. It can't be colorless. It's surrounded by what you could call color space.
So the internal property isn't being red, but the capacity for being colored.
Exactly. The object has to exist within this space of possible states of affairs.
And this logical space is total. Once you have all the simple objects, you've automatically defined every possible state of affairs that could ever exist. No logical surprises.
None. If all objects are given, all possibilities are given. The world, from a logical point of view, is finite in its capacity for arrangement.
Okay, so we've moved from the structure of reality itself, facts made from simple objects in a fixed logical space, to the tool we use to talk about it, language. This is where we get the famous and very controversial thesis, the picture theory.
Yeah, Proposition 4.01 gives you the core of it. A proposition is a picture of reality. But like you said, this is so much deeper than just resemblance. The picture theory claims an identity of structure.
What is that shared structure exactly?
It's the logical form.
Yeah.
The physical arrangement of the picture, say, the elements on a diagram, that's the pictorial form. But the capacity for those elements to represent other elements, to be placed in a certain relationship, that is the logical form. And that's what reality and the picture must have in common.
So if I draw a diagram of two billiard balls colliding, the arrangement of my dots on paper is the pictorial form.
Right.
But the very fact that those two dots can relate to each other in that way, just as the real balls can, that's the shared logical form.
You've absolutely nailed it. That logical form is what lets the picture, the proposition, reach out to reality and measure it. It's what allows the picture to represent reality, whether it ends up being true or false.
So if the logical form is missing, the statement isn't even false, it's just
nonsensical. It's not even capable of being false.
Okay, so let's look at the components. A name, a simple sign, that means one of those simple objects we talked about.
Yes, a name stands for an object, and the configuration of those names in the proposition corresponds directly to the configuration of objects in the state of affairs. It's a structural mirror.
But there's a huge limitation on language here. Objects can only be named, not asserted.
This is fundamental. This is his big anti-metaphysical move. Because objects are the fixed substance, language can't describe what they are, only how they're configured. If you try to say this object exists, you're trying to state something that has to be presupposed for any statement to make sense.
You can't put it into words.
Right. A proposition can only describe contingent arrangements.
Which brings us to the principle of multiplicity. This is what ensures the structure holds up.
Yes. The proposition has to have exactly as many distinguishable parts as the situation it represents. If the fact is complex, the linguistic picture has to be just as complex. This mathematical multiplicity is what lets us distinguish between different facts.
But he also says this multiplicity itself can't be depicted.
Because it's part of what language shows, not what it says. We don't state that a sentence has multiplicity. We just see that it has to have it to work as a picture. And this boundary between what is said and what is shown, that's the central tension of the whole book.
To make this super abstract idea more concrete, there's that brilliant analogy about universal depiction.
This is one of my favorite parts of the TLP. Think about four totally different things: a gramophone record, the musical idea in someone's head, the written score, and the sound waves in the air.
Physically, they couldn't be more different. Plastic grooves, neural impulses, ink on paper, air vibrations.
Right, and yet they all depict the same piece of music.
Because they stand in the same internal relation of depicting that idea.
And that's because they all share the same underlying logical construction. There has to be a common structural logic that makes it possible to translate the score into grooves, and the grooves into sound.
And what governs that translation is the projection rule.
The law of projection, yep. That rule is the mechanism that takes the logical structure from one medium and renders it in another. It's the key that lets us understand how a single idea can be expressed in completely different forms. This is the foundation for all imagery, all expression language, maps, schematics, you name it.
So the power of language isn't in its sound or its look, but in its abstract ability to be projected onto reality through this logical form.
Yes, and it means the possibility of description is rooted in a necessary, unsayable logical structure that exists totally independently of us.
So if the world is a totality of facts, and language is a picture of those facts, what happens when we try to talk about things that aren't facts, or things that try to describe logic itself? We're heading into the crisis zone for philosophy.
This is where the TLP goes from construction to demolition. Philosophy, in his system, is not a body of doctrine. It's not about making true statements like science does. Instead, it's purely an activity.
An activity aimed at the logical clarification of thoughts.
Exactly. The result of philosophy isn't philosophical propositions. The result is clarity. Philosophy's job is therapeutic. It cleans up the mess that sloppy language makes.
Which is where that famous line from the preface comes in. What can be said at all can be said clearly, and whereof one cannot speak thereof, one must be silent.
That's the whole mission statement. If you can't say it clearly, you can't even think it clearly, because thought and language share the same logical limits.
This view just turns centuries of metaphysics and ethics completely on its head. The questions aren't just hard, they're fundamentally broken.
They're broken. Proposition 4.003 just drops the hammer. Most propositions and questions that have been written about philosophical matters are not false, but senseless.
And that's the key distinction, right? Not false, but senseless.
Crucial distinction. If a statement is false, it still pictures a possible state of affairs. It's just that that state of affairs doesn't happen to exist. But if a statement is nonsensical, it fails to picture anything at all. It violates the rules of logical syntax.
So when a philosopher asks, what is the meaning of being, or something like that, they're not asking a deep question. They're just making sounds that don't conform to the rules of picturing.
That's the TLP's conclusion. And these nonsensical statements happen, he thinks, because we don't understand the logic of our ordinary, everyday language.
It's all dressed up and disguises our thoughts.
Exactly. Let's take his example of the word is.
Oh, yeah, this is a great one.
The word is a linguistic chameleon. It looks like the same word, but it functions as three totally different logical symbols. First, the copula. The house is big.
Linking a subject and a predicate.
Right. Second, the sign for equality. 3 times 1 is 3. And third, the expression of existence. There is a God.
And because we see the same word, we're tempted to think they're logically similar when they're completely different functions.
And that ambiguity creates the fundamental confusions that, in his view, all of traditional philosophy is built on. Another great example is a deceptive phrase like, green is green.
Where the first green is a proper name for a color, and the second is an adjective, a property.
They're completely different logical symbols, but they're represented by the same written sign. To avoid these errors, he says, we need a purified language governed by a strict logical grammar.
The Tractatus is his attempt to reveal that grammar, that logical skeleton underneath all meaningful language. But this is where the central tension comes in, isn't it? The TLP tries to impose this rigid logical structure.
But so much of the language we actually use, commanding, joking, asking questions, it doesn't fit neatly into that fact-picturing model.
And this brings us to the huge shift in Wittgenstein's own thinking years later. He basically rejected the whole premise of the TLP.
He did. He came to see that philosophy was suffering from what he called unway curly builder involuntary images that language forces on us. These deep-seated mental pictures that make us think abstract ideas like thoughts or understanding must be like, well, like space-occupying objects.
Like chairs or tables.
Exactly. And so we go searching for this invisible object called the mind when all that's there is a behavior or a process.
And the result is that the mind gets bumps from running up against the limits of language.
So his later therapeutic goal was to get over these images by looking not at the deep logical structure, but at the practical surface, the use of language in actual contexts, what he called language games.
This is perfectly illustrated by that builder and assistant example.
It is. The scenario is simple. A builder and an assistant. Their entire language is just 4 words. Slab, pillar, cube, beam. The builder shouts a word, the assistant brings the right block. That's it. That's a complete primitive language game.
Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoy this podcast.
And in that scenario, the word slab has no meaning outside of its use in that activity. The meaning isn't some metaphysical object, it's the practical act of being called and brought.
The shift is just radical.
Mm-hmm.
The TLP tried to explain all language by reducing it to its logical atoms. The language games approach just says meaning is use.
And the job of philosophy changes from explaining deep structure to just describing all the different things we do with words.
Okay, so that strictly constrained framework of the TLP, it had huge consequences for science, especially for empirical laws. If you can't infer one fact from a totally different fact, where does that leave causality?
It leaves causality, well, non-existent as a logical principle. The TLP says logical necessity only applies when the truth of one proposition is already contained within the sense of another. If 2 states of affairs are totally distinct, you can't logically infer one from the other.
So just because I've seen event A followed by event B a million times, I have zero logical basis to assume B must follow A the next time.
That is exactly right, which leads to his famous, really shocking conclusion. There is no such thing as a causal nexus that justifies such an inference. This is a direct assault on the philosophical foundation of a lot of classical science.
And what does he call that belief in a causal nexus?
Superstition, flat out. The belief in the causal nexus is superstition. The laws of physics we observe are just accidental facts about how the world happens to be, not necessary truths about its structure.
That's a huge claim. I mean, doesn't that just reduce all scientific prediction to guesswork?
It reduces it to hypothesis. Science works by building hypotheses that match our experience, but it's based on observation, not logical necessity. We can't deduce the future from the present. The example he uses is the sun will rise tomorrow.
Logically, that's just a hypothesis.
Just a hypothesis. We don't know it will rise. We just expect it to, out of habit. There's no logical force compelling the future to be like the past.
This also radically changes how we think about free will.
It does, beautifully. Free will exists precisely because the future isn't logically determined by the past. If it were, we'd have no freedom. Since the connection between our will and the world is accidental, a favor of fate, as he puts it, we are free.
So if a necessity has been stripped from the physical world, it must only exist in the system we use to describe it, which is logic itself.
The only necessity is logical necessity, and this brings us to the very special status of logic and mathematics in the TLP. The propositions of logic are all tautologies.
Right, statements like it is raining or is not raining. They're always true, but what do they actually say?
Now, they say absolutely nothing about the world of facts. They have zero logical content. They are true under all possible conditions. A tautology doesn't rule any possibility out.
So their only value is that they show the formal structure of the world, like the frame of a window shows the boundary of the view without being part of the view itself.
That is a perfect metaphor. Their key feature is that you can recognize their truth from the symbol alone. You don't need to look at reality to check if they're true. And he said this one insight contains in itself the whole philosophy of logic.
And where does that leave mathematics?
Mathematics is a logical method. Its propositions aren't about contingent facts. They're equations. He calls them pseudo-propositions. They don't express any thoughts about reality. Instead, math just demonstrates the necessary equivalences within the logical system.
So it's a tool for manipulating logic, not a science describing reality.
Exactly. Mathematical propositions are self-evident. We can see they are correct without having to compare them to any external facts.
Okay, so let's circle back to induction, the cornerstone of science. If it has no logical foundation, we're left with a purely psychological justification for using it.
Purely psychological. We use induction because we assume the simplest law that can be reconciled with our experiences. But why do we do that? Not because it's logically necessary, but because it's the most efficient way for our minds to process information. There are no logical grounds at all for believing the simplest case will actually happen.
He used that powerful analogy with Newtonian mechanics and the black spots on a white surface to clarify that.
Oh, this is so good. Imagine a white surface with random black spots. That's the totality of facts we observe. Newtonian mechanics is like laying a fixed grid, say, a square or triangular mesh over that surface. The laws of mechanics, like causality, are part of the grid, not the spots themselves.
So the law isn't a property of the spots, it's a property of the mesh we chose to cover them with.
Precisely. The fact that the world can be described by a mechanical system says something about the world, that it's orderly enough for that. But the specific laws themselves are a feature of our chosen representation, our logical framework. We impose the net, and then we mistakenly think the properties of the net are properties of the reality underneath it.
So we've meticulously mapped the world of the sayable. It's the world of accidental facts, which can be pictured by language that follows a strict logical syntax. But this whole structure forces us to confront the boundary itself, what's on the other side, what lies outside the logical limits of language.
This is the most profound and honestly the most often misunderstood part of the TLP. He is hyperlogical all the way through, only to declare that the most important things lie in the realm of the unspoken. And the central statement is, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world.
The logic fills the world, he says. We can't think outside the logical limits of language, so what we can't think, we can't say. The boundaries of the world and thought are the same.
And this boundary concept is the key to understanding solipsism, the idea that only one's own mind is sure to exist. He says what the solipsist means is quite correct, but it can't be said. It can only be shown.
How does it show itself, then, if you can't put it into words?
It shows itself in the very fact that the limits of my language, the language I use, define the limits of my world. The fact that I experience the world as this bounded, coherent whole, that is the solipsistic truth. The world and life are one, he says. I am my world, the microcosm.
And the person who perceives this, the metaphysical subject, isn't something you can find in the world like a brain.
No, absolutely not. The philosophical I is not a body or a soul you can study. It's the limit of the world. It's like the eye in the visual field. You can't see your own eye, only what it sees. The subject is the necessary condition for there to be a world at all, but it's not a part of that world.
Okay, now we get to the really big stuff. The things that seem to defy any factual description. Ethics, aesthetics, and value.
In the world of facts, everything is accidental. The sun rising is an accident. The configuration of atoms that makes you is an accident. So there can't be any inherent value in the world. If value exists, if something is non-accidental and necessary, it has to lie outside the world.
Otherwise, value would just be another contingent fact.
It would. And the necessary consequence of this is that there can be no propositions of ethics.
You can't construct a sentence that successfully pictures a state of affairs called goodness.
You can't. Propositions can't express anything higher than a fact. So ethics can't be put into words. It is transcendental. It lies beyond the possibility of representation.
And in this really powerful synthesis, he connects two fields that seem totally separate.
He does. Ethics and aesthetics are one. They both deal with that necessary non-contingent structure of value that lies outside the world of facts. They both deal with the meaning of life, which you can't find in life, only beyond it.
This has radical implications for how we judge moral action. If ethics is transcendental, we can't judge an action by its consequences.
Because the consequences are just more accidental facts in the world. He concludes that ethical reward and punishment have to be in the action itself. If you act ethically, the reward is in the act. The worldly consequences are irrelevant to its ethical value.
And this transcendental silence, it also extends to the divine and the mystical.
God doesn't reveal himself in the world of facts. Any attempt to describe God using factual propositions is nonsensical.
And what defines the mystical for him?
The mystical is not how the world is, not the collection of facts, but that it exists at all. That feeling that the world is a limited, coherent whole, that's the mystical feeling. It's a sense of wonder that you can't translate into a statement.
So we've built this entire elaborate logical architecture only to discover that it stands completely outside the things that truly matter to human beings. And this brings us to that famous self-consuming conclusion of the TLP throwing away the ladder.
It's the most intellectually dazzling move in the whole book. He says, if a question can be framed in logical language, it can be answered. Therefore, if the answer can't be put into words, neither can the question. And he concludes, the riddle does not exist. The deepest philosophical questions are just meaningless attempts to doubt, where no sensible question can even be asked.
But wait a minute. If all these philosophical statements about logic, ethics, the limits of language are meaningless, then the sentences in the Tractatus itself must also be meaningless.
That is the necessary and fully intended conclusion. He knew that the propositions he was writing were violating the very limits he was trying to establish. They're meant to be elucidatory. The reader, once they've grasped the system, has to finally recognize these propositions as senseless.
You use the structure to climb out of the philosophical mess, and then you have to kick it away.
He literally tells the reader he must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up on it. You have to surmount these propositions to finally see the world correctly and to recognize the profound meaning of the silence that's left.
Which leads to that definitive final sentence, Proposition 7, the culmination of the entire work. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent.
What an audacious, monumental piece of work. It's the sound of a philosopher who took the problems of philosophy so seriously that his only solution was to eliminate them completely through logic.
And yet, on a personal level, there was this profound acceptance of life beyond that rigid logic. The day before he died from cancer in 1951, Ludwig Wittgenstein reportedly said, "Tell them I had a wonderful life."
A moment of pure, unsayable value.
Let's try and nail down the 6 central takeaways for everyone listening to sort of encapsulate this whole journey.
Sounds good.
Okay, first, the world is defined by facts. What is the case? Not just by a collection of physical things.
Second, language works as a picture of these facts because language and reality share a deep, necessary logical structure.
Third, most of traditional philosophy is built on linguistic confusion. Its problems are ultimately nonsensical rather than just false.
Fourth, logic, which is made of tautologies, and mathematics, made of equations, they say nothing about the world's facts. Their only job is to show the world's logical structure and its space of possibility.
Fifth, causality and induction have no logical basis. They're based on psychological expectation, our tendency to assume the simplest pattern. The belief in a causal nexus is, in his own words, a superstition.
And finally, sixth, the really important things, ethics, aesthetics, and the mystical, are transcendental. They lie completely outside the world of accidental facts. They can't be put into propositions. They can only be shown.
So here's the final provocative thought we want to leave you with. The Tractatus concluded that all philosophical problems were solved by showing they were just linguistic misunderstandings. If the problems were truly eliminated by this logical clarification, what does that imply about the value of Wittgenstein's own later work, which took the messiness of language use, the language games, as its new philosophical starting point? Was the latter thrown away too soon, or was the ultimate silence of Proposition 7 simply unbearable for a mind so relentlessly driven to understand? Something to mull over until our next deep dive.